All right, so this is part 2 of our engine rebuild out of the Bobcat 773. This is a Kubota V2203. To watch the first part of the engine rebuild, I'll leave a link down in the description. That's where we did the crank, pistons, the timing gears, all that. So part 2, what we're going to do is we're going to start working on the fuel system, the front cover. We'll probably get the head, the oil pan, and some other covers and stuff bolted on. But we're going to take a little bit of time on the fuel system because not only are we going to look at how it goes together, but we're going to take a close look at how it works, because I want you to understand how the governor and everything works, and that'll also help you in future troubleshooting. So let's go ahead and get right into looking at the springs and the governor assembly and how we're going to assemble that with the front cover. Okay, right here we're looking at our governor assembly. This governor works off centrifugal force, and we're going to take a look at that here in a minute. If you can see, we've got two independent levers. Okay, now when the engine's running, these levers work as one lever. They are running against each other, and this will all make sense in a minute. But in the start position, or when the engine is in the off position and we turn our key on and the fuel shutoff solenoid pulls out of the way, this is what it's going to look like at that point. And see this hole? Yeah, you can barely see it. This is a hole for a start spring. And it's important that that start spring holds this lever all the way. It keeps the fuel rack in the full fuel position. So this is wide open throttle. And why that's important, because when you go to start your Bobcat in the morning, you turn the key on, it doesn't matter where you put your throttle lever or your foot throttle, whatever the case may be, that spring, that hole right there, we'll look at the spring in just a second, but that is holding this rack, the fuel rack here on the injection pump, in the full open position. So you're at wide open throttle anyways. It doesn't matter where you put your throttle lever. As soon as you start that engine, you're at wide open throttle, and the governor takes over nearly instantly. That's why you don't have a lot of, it doesn't sound like it's wide open throttle, but it is until the governor takes over and it brings it back down to the idle position where you got that throttle lever set. Now here's the springs we're talking about. These two springs go inside of each other, and these are perfectly balanced with the weight of the governor. And again, this will all make sense here toward the end. But these go inside of each other like that. This right here is that start spring. So the hole in the governor lever that we just looked at is where this spring goes. And then it also hooks to a pin on the front cover. It's this pin here, but we'll look on the inside of the front cover and you'll see what it looks like. The problem is a lot of people does not know that this spring is inside the front cover, so when they pull their engine apart, here's a couple start springs that are stretched. These came out of other engines that I just have sitting out as an example. So these are already stretched, which means that it's not going to pull that fuel rack into the fuel flow position. So you got to remember that you can't just pull your front cover off without disconnecting this spring first, or you're going to have to replace the spring. We can't respring that or get it tight again. It's stretched, it's no good. So what I've got is I've got a spare crankshaft here, I'm sorry, a fuel camshaft. And inside here we can see these balls, these ball bearings ride on a ramp. Remember, we're talking about centrifugal force working together with spring pressure to set the idle speed on our engine. So what happens is this spins up to speed. Centrifugal force is spinning these balls outward, which are riding up a ramp and pushing against this plate right here, and that's what's pushing against our governor. So you can see I'm just holding it in the down position right now, how that moves. Let's actually put it in the vise, spin it up to speed, and see how that centrifugal force works. Okay, I'm going to use my drill, and I'm going to go ahead and start spinning this. See, I can hold this plate right here, and really there's no pressure at all on this plate. I can just move it in and out with my fingers, no problem, because I don't have much centrifugal force on it. But let's spin this engine speed up a little bit. See how them balls are now pushing out? Now I've got to put quite a bit of pressure with my fingers against that plate to push it back in against the balls. So the balls are pushing it this way. Let's spin it up to speed. Now I've really got to push back hard to get those balls to go back in. So that's our spring pressure taking over at that point. Me pushing against that plate is simulating spring pressure. The balls push it back out in that direction. That signifies the centrifugal force. So it's a balancing act to set our idle speed. So hopefully that kind of gives you a little idea of how the governor on this V2203 works. Now real quick, this is the throttle linkage assembly out of a reefer motor. And you'll notice that there's no hole here for the start spring in the reefer motor because they're designed to run at a constant RPM. So if you're going to replace your Bobcat engine with a reefer engine out of a refrigerated unit, that's why we call them a reefers, they come out of the big 18-wheeler trucks, you'll have to drill a hole into this lever for your start spring to hook to your front cover. So just a quick tip if you are doing a reefer engine. Now the front cover, I've already got kind of assembled, ready to go. I've already done my water pump and water inlets, and you can also see that, or maybe you can't, is I've got all my bolts in here because there's like 4 or 5 different size bolts on this front cover, and I just want to put them all through there and make sure they all come out equally. That way I know I've got them all in the right spot before I put them on there. It is going to be difficult to see, but here is where that pin right there is where that spring hooks to. There's a little hole in there, so that's where the start spring is going to go. This other pin right here is your fuel adjustment screw. That's where you're going to increase or decrease the amount of fuel, or the travel, I guess, of the fuel rack itself. So that's tamper-proof. We're not going to mess with that right now. And you can see that I've also got the O-rings already in place that go in this front cover. So what I've done is I've got my gasket on here, and I don't really like to use much silicone. People will silicone these whole gaskets on. I just put a little dab in a couple spots just to kind of hold it in place, so when I put my front cover on, all my bolt holes line up. So just enough silicone just to kind of hold it in place, just a couple dabs. But all right, you can see inside here where I've got my spring. Remember those 2 springs? We had one on the inside, one on the outside. I know this light's kind of washing it out, but I do have those hooked in right there. I like to put these springs on before I put the cover on, because then I can come down here with a pick. You can see the 2 springs there, the one on the inside, and we can hook those to our throttle control lever. And we'll take a look at that in a minute. But that does not hook to the front cover. It's just easier for me to put them in place before I put the front cover on. I'll put the front cover on, and then we'll go ahead and, well, let's go ahead and put the start spring on real quick, and then we'll put the front cover on. Okay, so it's on there, it's hooked around. Got to be careful because I have dropped those, and I've had to pull the front cover back off, but it's just really hard to, you kind of get the picture, it's just really hard to show on video how to hook all these springs up, but I'll try. And I did go ahead and replace my front crank seal in the cover as well, so that has already been replaced. There's a couple dial pins that the front cover will hook to. And we can just go through by hand and get all these bolts started. So now what I'm going to do is we're going to try to hook this in the front cover here. If I can keep from kicking the camera and see enough light. I can't even see that pin right there. There we go. So I'm going to grab the start spring with a pair of needle nose pliers. Let's see if I can't. Fucking camera's all up in my way. Okay. Sorry, I was bumping the camera around, but you can see now it's hooked to the front cover. So I only put 2 bolts in the front cover. I just kind of snugged them down. I didn't tighten everything down because, like I said, I've dropped that spring before, so I've had to pull that front cover back off. That's why I only tightened 2 bolts. So now I can go ahead and torque all the front cover bolts because we know that that's not coming back off. Right. All right, so we got the front cover on and torqued down. So the next thing we're going to do is, remember we got the other 2 springs inside of there, and now we've got to hook that to our throttle control plate. And it's going to hook down here on this. This is where our throttle linkage actually hooks up. So this is what you're vroom, vroom, revving it up, you know. So that's what those springs are going to hook to, but we just got to get them in there. So I'm just going to use a hook pick. We're going to reach in here and grab those and try to put them on here. Let's see if we can. Maybe that'll work. So we got the springs hooked to the lever now. We do have a new gasket, of course, under our throttle control plate. And we did replace the O-ring underneath here because this is one of the sources for an oil leak underneath here. So now that that's all hooked up, we know we got spring pressure against the throttle lever. We can feel it in there, which is good. So we'll go ahead and get this bolted down next. And then we'll work on getting our injection pump in and our fuel stop lever. So we're about to bolt down the fuel injection pump itself. But what I want to look at is this lever, or yeah, this governor lever. See this slot right here? I'm trying to get it right. Well, you can see what I'm pointing at right there when I get my finger in the way, but you can see what we're moving right here. That's the injection pump tab is going to have to slide down in that slot right there. So it's important that we get that lined up and the injection pump down right in that slot. So that's this tab right here on the injection pump. Right there, that's what's going to slide down in that slot. So these plates here, I mean, they look like gaskets, which they are. They do seal. But these are actual shims. Now the thickness of the shims are different. We've got different size shims, and what this does is the shims is how we time the actual injection. This is injection timing, not to be confused with engine timing. So the more shims we use, we retard the injection timing. If we remove shims, we actually advance the injection timing. So we can set that after we get the engine put together, but I'm just going to use the same shims that came off the motor. I'm going to put it right back on. Now our injection pump, I'm just going to put my finger in the fuel shutoff slot. And I'm just going to line up that little dimple, that little slot, make sure that our fuel rack actually engages that. Okay. And our injection pump doesn't go flat until we actually put the bolts on to pull it flat, because those cams are spring loaded, so it's kind of holding it up a little bit. So we're going to go ahead and get the bolts in here and just pull this down and torque it to spec. So now that our injection pump is installed and torqued to spec, what we're going to do is put our stop lever in place. This is what our fuel shutoff solenoid hooks to. Now I went ahead and replaced the seal in here too, and unlike the throttle linkage up here, your governor control up here, that uses an O-ring to seal. This actually uses a lip seal in here. So it's got a little roll pin here where we pop this lever off, pull the shaft out, and replace that lip seal, because that's also a good spot for oil to leak. So we have this little lever here. It doesn't hook to anything. It actually fits in another slot inside the linkage in here. Pretty easy to see. We just kind of get that lined up. Of course, we do have a new gasket. We'll just make sure it kind of gets into that slot. There's a lot of tolerance there, so it's pretty easy to get it in place. And then we'll get our bolts in here, and we'll torque that to spec. Okay, so this is just the rear cover for the governor. Of course, we're going to go ahead and replace that gasket. And just get this installed. So like I said, this is nothing more than a cover on this engine. If you could see there on the end of the fuel pump, it is a splined shaft that we could actually run an accessory off of the engine if we had to. But on the Bobcats, we don't use that. So literally just a cover. So we'll get that installed and torque to spec as well. And finally, for the fuel system, I think we'll just go ahead and install our lift pump here, of course, with a new gasket. So we're about ready to bolt down the head itself, but I think first what we're going to do is go ahead and get this oil pan installed, and of course torqued to spec. And you'll notice that I'm not using any silicone. That's why we have gaskets. We should not have to silicone. Gosh, I hate tearing down an engine where somebody silicones every gasket in place like they need that extra sealant. I mean, to each his own, but that's what the gasket's for. It seals. It doesn't need any extra help, or it shouldn't need any extra help. There's a lot of bolts in this oil pan, so we'll just take our time, get them all installed one by one. There is a torque sequence. When in doubt, just circle out. So we'll just kind of start in the middle and work our way out on the torque sequence of the oil pan bolts. So now I think we're about ready to bolt the head down. So let's get our head gasket. And an O-ring. Let's take a closer look at what's about to happen here. So what I'm using today is a composite head gasket as opposed to a steel head gasket. So right here we have an oil tube. This is the small little tube that sticks up here that feeds our top end with oil. Oil going into our rocker arm or rocker bridge. So we're going to set this head gasket in place. Now it's very important when you use a composite head gasket, you've got to have this O-ring. A lot of people don't know that, and they'll just put a head gasket on, and what happens, you're going to start leaking oil out of here, out of the back of your head, because they did not remember this O-ring. So that O-ring goes around that oil feed tube. Now when you're using a metal head gasket, you don't necessarily need that O-ring, but I do use a little bit of silicone above and below the head gasket, just a little bit around there, just to make sure that it does not leak. So we get our head gasket in place. As a matter of fact, I guess before I put the head gasket on, I've got to get the lifters dropped down in their tubes here. Alright, now that our lifter's installed, now we can put our head gasket down. And set our head in place. So one thing I do is we go ahead and just dip all these threads in oil before we start putting our head bolts in. Gives them a little lubrication so we torque them to spec. They will torque properly. Now I know someone is going to probably say, why aren't you using new head bolts? Good practice is to use new head bolts. I don't always. These head bolts are really expensive, so we're just going to reuse the ones we have this time. And we just use our impact for speed, just to kind of take these down before we torque them to spec. So what works for me is 3 rounds, and we also got to retorque these after we run the engine and get it hot. But to start with, we're going to start, you know, in the middle. We do have a spec, but it kind of just crosses and circles all the way out. I've done these 100 times, so I kind of remember the torque sequence on these. But I'm going to start at about 35 pounds for my first sequence. Then I'm going to do 55, and then I'm going to go to 75. And that's what works for me. Again, check your manual and you torque it to what your manual says, but this is the way that I always do the 2203. So I think that's about all we're going to do for this part 2 of the engine build series. We went over a lot of important stuff, mainly the fuel system and just bolting the head on really and the front cover. On the next video, what we're going to do is we're just going to start bolting on all the accessories. You know, we got sensors to put on, we got to do the rockers, we got to set our valve clearances, we got to put on our crank pulley. So it's just sensors and covers and accessories, injectors and stuff like that on the next video. But we covered a lot of important stuff on there. If there's something we missed or something that you need more clarification on, please don't hesitate to ask. Thanks for watching.